The Canadian Army spent much of 1916 trying to get rid of the Ross rifle. In mud, under pressure with wartime ammunition, the rifle had earned a terrible reputation. Men had abandoned it in battle and taken Leon fields from wherever they could find them. Yet one small group did not want every Ross to disappear. Canadian sharpshooters kept carefully selected examples, fitted some with telescopic sights, and treated them less like ordinary service rifles than precision instruments. Because their problem was different. An infantry rifle had to keep firing when everything was dirty and desperate. A sniper's rifle had to do something far more unnerving. It had to fire once and leave the enemy with nothing useful to fire back at. That difference helps explain one of the strangest reversals on the Western Front. In 1915, German marksmen had made daylight dangerous for British and Canadian troops. By the later years of the war, Canadian snipers had become feared specialists themselves, and some of the most famous among them were Indigenous and Metis soldiers, whose own country still denied them basic political rights. The story is often reduced to kill totals. Francis Pegahmagabow is frequently credited in later accounts with 378 kills. Henry Norwest's tally is commonly given as 115. Johnson Paudash is associated with 88. Those numbers are dramatic, but they can hide the more important question. How could a handful of riflemen affect hundreds of enemy soldiers who were not hit at all? The answer begins before Canada had an effective sniper system of its own. When trench warfare hardened across the Western Front, Germany entered the contest with a serious advantage in optical sights, prepared firing positions, and trained marksmen. British forces did not begin the war with the same organized answer. Major Hesketh-Prichard, a British hunter and marksman, who later became central to British sniper training, described arriving in France in 1915 and finding a line that was being punished in a way the army was poorly equipped to stop. The losses did not always come during famous attacks. Hesketh-Prichard later recalled periods when a single battalion could lose many men in one day to German rifle fire, even though no major battle was underway. The source material for this story cites one especially severe day with 18 men lost in one battalion. Whether every sector experienced the same rate is not the point. The important fact is the pattern. The front could consume men quietly, one exposed head or shoulder at a time, without producing the kind of event that appeared in a headline. German marksmen also learned to read the human structure of the opposing trench. Officers could be distinguished by behavior, equipment, or details of dress. Hesketh-Prichard believed even the cut of British riding breeches could help identify an officer during an attack. A sniper, therefore, did not have to shoot randomly. He could remove the person most likely to be carrying authority, information, or the power to organize movement. That gave each bullet two possible effects. The first was physical. One man was wounded or killed. The second was organizational. The soldiers around him lost confidence in the act that had exposed him, and sometimes lost the person they depended on for direction. They came during ordinary daylight. A soldier looked over a parapet. An officer crossed an exposed section of trench. A working party raised itself for a few seconds too long. A rifle cracked after the bullet had already arrived. Then everyone still alive had to decide whether the next necessary movement was worth becoming the next visible target. That is what made sniper fire different from many other threats. Artillery was vastly more destructive, but artillery often gave soldiers something to interpret. A barrage had sound, direction, rhythm, and duration. Men learned what kind of cover helped. They learned when movement was possible. A single rifle bullet could offer almost none of that. The round arrived first, the sound followed. If the shooter did not fire again, there might be no second flash, no repeated crack from the same position, no pattern for an observer to build, and no obvious point for artillery to punish. The physical casualty might be one man. The behavioral casualty could be a whole stretch of trench. Periscopes remained low. Repair work waited for darkness. Officers reduced unnecessary movement. Observation suffered. Artillery lost eyes. Every small task above the parapet acquired a new price. This was the problem the Canadians encountered when the 1st Canadian Division reached France in early 1915. They soon fought through the Second Battle of Ypres, where chlorine gas introduced a new form of terror and thousands of Canadian soldiers became casualties. Among the men who survived that world was an Ojibwe private from the Parry Sound area of Ontario, Francis Pegahmagabow. He had enlisted in August 1914. Before the war, he had worked on the Great Lakes and had grown up with skills rooted in hunting and life around Georgian Bay. Later accounts of his service describe a soldier extraordinarily comfortable, moving through exposed ground, scouting, observing, and waiting. He was not alone. More than 4,000 First Nations men are known to have served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, despite policies and social structures that did not treat Indigenous people as political equals. Métis and Inuit volunteers also served, though the surviving record does not always allow the same clean totals. That scale matters because the sniper story can otherwise become a collection of exceptional biographies detached from the country that produced them. Indigenous enlistment happened inside a system that constrained movement, land, money, and political rights through federal law and the authority of Indian agents. The contradiction was present before any of these men reached Europe. Pegahmagabow had been orphaned young and raised near Georgian Bay. The skills later celebrated in military retellings were not invented by the army. They came from a life in which tracking, weather, patience, and the economical use of ammunition were practical knowledge. He also carried an Ojibwe medicine pouch overseas, a personal object that later accounts connect with his wartime identity. It is easy to turn such details into legend. More useful is to see what the army could actually use. A man accustomed to moving quietly through difficult ground and remaining composed while observation mattered more than speed. Norwest's route was different. He had a reputation outside the army as a ranch worker, saddler, rodeo rider, and dancer. His first attempt at military service ended in discharge. He came back months later under the name Henry Norwest and stayed. In the line, comrades remembered extraordinary stillness and concealment. Those memories are qualitative, not a measurement, but they fit the kind of work he later performed. Henry Norwest, a Métis soldier from Alberta, had worked as a ranch hand and rodeo performer. His first enlistment ended quickly. He later returned under the name by which history remembers him and joined the 50th Battalion. Johnson Paudash, an Ojibwe soldier from Hiawatha First Nation, enlisted as an older man by the standards of many wartime volunteers. John Shiwak came from Labrador and served in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. An Inuit hunter before the war, he became known for shooting in fieldcraft before shellfire killed him in 1917. Their backgrounds were not identical, and there was no mystical quality that turned Indigenous identity into marksmanship. The useful connection was practical experience. A hunter who had learned to read wind, conceal movement, wait without fidgeting, and make a single cartridge matter already possessed habits that trench warfare suddenly valued. Those habits became more powerful when the army added a system around them. The important unit was not always one man with a rifle. It was often a pair. The shooter watched through his sight. Beside him, an observer used a more powerful telescope to search the enemy line, judge conditions, identify a target, and watch what happened after the shot. That observer solved two problems at once. First, he improved the quality of the shot. Second, he gave the army a method for recording results. A claim could be entered only when someone else saw enough to support it. That is why the word confirmed matters so much in sniper history. It is not proof that every surviving wartime tally is perfect. Records, standards, and later retellings can still disagree. But confirmation imposed discipline on a form of combat that otherwise invited legend. The famous totals therefore need two ideas held at once. A recorded number can be meaningful because it was tied to observation and paperwork, and still remain an imperfect historical measure because standards varied, records were lost, and men did not always operate with witnesses. Pegahmagabow's enormous total is a good example. Later accounts often repeat 378, but the source itself notes that his work frequently took him beyond the kind of paired observation that made confirmation easiest. The number belongs to his historical reputation, but it should not be treated as a laboratory measurement. Norwest's 115 carries a somewhat different kind of weight because the source describes a stricter battalion tally based on witnessed results. Even there, the total says less about the real battlefield effect than it appears to. A sniper who fires at an artillery observer, a machine gunner, or an officer may change more than one life with one hit. A sniper who does not fire because the conditions are wrong may also be doing his job well. The ledger measures events that can be recorded. It does not measure every movement prevented, every repair delayed, every periscope lowered, or every patrol rerouted. That gap between measurable kills and unmeasurable behavior is exactly where the larger story lives. The tally can tell us what happened to some of the men who were hit. It cannot easily count what happened inside the decisions of those who remained alive. More important, the observer helped protect the thing that made sniper fire so difficult to answer: silence after the shot. A second shot from the same position might reveal direction. A third might confirm it. Repeated firing could turn a hidden threat into a target. So the safest shot was not simply the most accurate one. It was the shot that did not need a correction. That logic changed the battlefield equation. The enemy did not need to know that a particular rifleman was brilliant. He only needed to learn that visibility could bring sudden death and that the source might never reveal itself again. Once that expectation formed, fear began doing work that ammunition could not. And here the Ross rifle returned to the story. Before the war, the Ross had been admired for accuracy. It was a Canadian service rifle born from a political desire for a domestic weapon and a design culture that prized precision. On a clean range, those qualities looked impressive. In Flanders mud, they could become liabilities. The Ross's tight tolerances did not tolerate every combination of dirt, rough handling, and variable wartime ammunition gracefully. During the fighting at Ypres, Canadian soldiers reported serious stoppages. Some discarded their rifles and took Lee Enfields from British soldiers or casualties. The argument over the rifle became a national scandal. Canada's militia minister Sam Hughes defended it long after frontline confidence had collapsed. The reason the dispute became so bitter was that both sides could point to something real. Supporters could demonstrate impressive accuracy under controlled conditions. Frontline troops could answer that a service rifle was useless if its excellence disappeared. When the chamber was dirty, ammunition varied, or the bolt refused to operate under fire. The argument was not really about whether the Ross could shoot straight. It was about which requirement mattered most in war. That distinction was difficult to hear in a political controversy because it sounded like contradiction. How could a rifle be too unreliable for ordinary infantry and still be worth preserving for specialist marksmen? The answer was selection and use. A sniper section could choose an unusually accurate rifle, maintain it carefully, protect it from abuse, pair it with selected ammunition when possible, and fire at a much lower rate. The conditions that exposed the Ross's weaknesses in mass infantry fighting were not identical to the conditions of a hidden precision shot. Eventually, the Ross was withdrawn as the standard Canadian infantry rifle in France. That should have ended its wartime career. Instead, it created a useful separation between two jobs. The average infantryman needed reliability first. The specialist marksman could accept more maintenance and a more temperamental mechanism if the particular rifle in his hands delivered exceptional accuracy. So selected Ross rifles survived in sniper service, including rifles fitted with telescopic sights such as the Warner and Swayze and the Winchester A5. They were not proof that the Ross had been secretly a good general service rifle. They proved something narrower. A failed tool in one role can still be effective in another if the requirements change. For a sniper who might wait for hours to fire once, the Ross's precision could matter more than the qualities the mass infantry desperately needed. The rifle was only one part of the system. The rest of the system was concealment, observation, record-keeping, disciplined fire, and patience. That system had to defeat German countermeasures. German troops protected dangerous observation points with armored loophole plates. Counter-snipers searched for British and Canadian firing positions. Any repeated muzzle flash or suspicious gap could attract concentrated fire. The British and Canadians answered with their own technical adaptations. Hesketh-Prichard tested captured armor and looked for ways to defeat protected firing points. Heavy hunting rifles and armor-piercing ammunition were among the tools used against plates that ordinary rounds could not reliably penetrate. Another method was less powerful but more ingenious. The problem was simple to describe and difficult to solve. A German sniper who fired only once might leave almost no usable clue. So British camouflage work tried to make that first shot reveal something. Artists and technicians produced convincing dummy heads, sometimes detailed enough to suggest a real soldier at the parapet. The dummy could be lifted briefly into view, presenting exactly the kind of target an enemy marksman had been trained to exploit. If the German fired, the head could be dropped as if hit. The important evidence was then inside the dummy itself. A bullet that entered one side and left the other created 2 points. Those points formed a line. Extend that line backward and observers could search for the likely firing location. The method did not magically locate every sniper, and battlefield geometry was never as clean as a diagram. But it turned the enemy's discipline against him by converting one carefully chosen shot into information. Camouflage specialists produced realistic dummy heads that could be raised above a trench as bait. A German sniper might fire at the apparent soldier. If the bullet passed through the dummy, the entry and exit points could help observers estimate the line of fire back toward the shooter's position. What had been an invisible rifle now had a geometric clue attached to it. The hidden war was becoming a contest not only of marksmanship, but of information. Who could expose less? Who could learn more from the enemy's exposure? Who could fire without giving the other side enough data to answer? By 1917, that contest was no longer confined to quiet trench sectors. The Canadian Corps was preparing for Vimy Ridge. The ridge was heavily fortified and had resisted earlier Allied efforts. For the Canadians, the battle became a test of a broader doctrine: detailed preparation, wider distribution of information, artillery coordination, specialized infantry tasks, and repeated rehearsal. The significance of that preparation becomes clearer when placed beside the sniper problem. Early in the war, German marksmen had exploited visible hierarchy. Officers could sometimes be identified by clothing, behavior, or location. Remove the officer and a unit could lose direction. At Vimy, Canadian planning worked to reduce that vulnerability. Soldiers were briefed on objectives and rehearsed their tasks so that units could continue when leaders became casualties. The Army was learning the same lesson at 2 different scales. Do not let one exposed point control the whole system. For a sniper, that meant do not fire twice from the same place if one shot would do. For an infantry formation, it meant do not leave all knowledge in one man's pocket. On April 9, 1917, the Canadian Corps attacked through snow and sleet behind a carefully timed artillery barrage. Henry Norwest was part of that war within the larger war. During the Vimy fighting, he used his rifle to cover Canadian movement and target German defenders. His military medal citation credited his shooting with saving Canadian lives. The ridge fell after days of fighting at a terrible cost. The source material gives Canadian casualties of more than 10,000, including more than 3,000 dead, while thousands of German prisoners were taken. Those totals describe the scale of the battle. They do not explain it. The explanation lay in combined preparation. Artillery moved in a timed curtain. Infantry followed close enough to exploit its effect. Units trained on models. Men were briefed on objectives beyond their immediate task. Specialized roles made platoons less dependent on one kind of weapon or one leader. Snipers fit into that system as a tool for removing exposed defenders and denying observation at critical moments. But the more important development for this story was not the mythology that later formed around Vimy. It was that precision shooting had become integrated into a larger combined system. The sniper was no longer simply a hunter waiting for an isolated target. He could protect an advance, remove a machine gun crew when it exposed itself, observe enemy preparations, or deny the opponent the freedom to use a specific piece of ground. That last function mattered enormously. At Hill 70 later in 1917, Canadian forces seized high ground near Lens and faced repeated German counterattacks. The Canadian plan depended on holding ground under sustained pressure and using prepared fire to break assaults. That made information exceptionally valuable. Knowing that a counterattack was forming could be worth more than firing at the first soldier who appeared. Johnson Paudash's role in the fighting illustrates how observation could matter as much as the shot itself. From his position, he detected signs of an impending German counterattack and passed the warning back. When the attack came, Canadian troops were ready. The rifleman had become part of an early warning system. A sniper's value could therefore exceed his own tally. One pair of eyes could cue machine guns, mortars, or artillery. One warning could change the readiness of a larger formation. And one well-placed shot could deny the enemy access to the observation point needed to do the same thing in return. This is where the idea of paralysis becomes more precise. No serious army is literally stopped forever by one rifle. Artillery, patrols, counter-snipers, armor, darkness, smoke, trench construction, and sheer necessity all provided ways to adapt. But within a particular time and piece of ground, the cost of exposure could become so uncertain that movement slowed sharply. That mattered because trench warfare depended on hundreds of small visible tasks. A wire party had to stand or crawl in the open. An observer had to see beyond his own parapet. A messenger had to cross a dangerous gap. A machine gun crew had to occupy a firing position. An officer had to inspect a threatened sector. If each of those actions carried an unpredictable chance of a bullet from an unseen position, the safest response was delay. Delay the repair, wait for darkness, use a different route, keep the periscope lower, send fewer men, move faster and observe less. Every decision reduced immediate risk. Taken together, they also reduced the unit's ability to see, repair, communicate, and control its ground. That is the central mechanism. The sniper did not have to kill hundreds of men. He had to make hundreds of men recalculate what daylight was worth. The Canadian Army did not invent that psychological effect. German marksmen had demonstrated it first and brutally. What changed was that Canadians built their own version of the system, and in some sectors applied it with unusual effectiveness. Indigenous and Metis soldiers became prominent in that story, because some arrived with field skills that adapted exceptionally well to it. The irony is impossible to separate from the achievement. More than 4,000 First Nations men served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, along with Métis and Inuit volunteers whose participation is harder to quantify in surviving records. They served a country that did not extend equal political rights to them, and that continued to control many Indigenous lives through the Indian Act and the authority of government agents. The war needed their competence before the state was willing to recognize their equality. Francis Pegahmagabow carried that contradiction through almost the entire war. He fought from 1915 into the final campaigns of 1918, was wounded, returned to service, and earned the military medal with 2 bars, a rare distinction. His later reputation centers on the enormous number of enemy soldiers he was credited with killing, but his citations also describe courage in tasks that had nothing to do with a sniper tally. During the final advance in 1918, for example, he moved through dangerous ground to bring back ammunition when his company was running short. That matters because it prevents the legend from swallowing the soldier. He was not a number attached to a rifle. He was an infantryman, scout, messenger, observer, and survivor inside a larger unit. The same is true of Norwest. By the summer of 1918, his reputation was already established. He had survived years of a job built around being unseen. Then the war entered its final great movement. At Amiens in August, Allied forces prepared a surprise attack that would help open the Hundred Days Offensive. German intelligence had learned to treat the location of the Canadian Corps as important evidence about where a major British offensive might come. That reputation created an operational problem for the Allies. Moving the Canadians could warn the enemy, so deception measures were used to suggest Canadian movement elsewhere, while the Corps shifted toward Amiens in secrecy. Radio traffic and visible troop movements helped feed the false picture. The source describes Canadian units being sent conspicuously toward Flanders while the main corps moved under tighter secrecy toward the real assembly area. Whatever weight each deception measure carried, the underlying fact is clear. Canadian movement had become important enough to German intelligence that the Allies considered it something worth disguising. That is a remarkable escalation in the meaning of reputation. Years earlier, a German sniper's reputation controlled a small piece of trench because men feared lifting their heads. Now the reputation of an entire Canadian formation could shape what enemy staffs expected to happen next. The common element was prediction. Soldiers and staffs both make decisions from incomplete information. A threat becomes powerful when the other side changes behavior before the threat is fully visible. On August 8th, the attack began without the kind of long preliminary bombardment that would have announced the target far in advance. The Canadian Corps advanced deeply into the German position on a day that General Erich Ludendorff later described as a black day for the German army. The significance of the Canadian reputation had now moved beyond individual trenches. At first, fear had been local. A man might refuse to lift his head because a hidden rifle controlled one strip of ground. By 1918, German intelligence was also watching where the Canadian Corps appeared, because that movement itself could signal danger. The scale had changed from a loophole to an operational map. Norwest returned to the fighting during this period. On August 18, 1918, near Hallu in the Somme region, he went forward with other men to deal with German marksmen who were troubling Canadian positions. This time, the enemy saw first. A German bullet struck Norwest in the head and killed him. He was buried at Warvillers. The men who had watched him survive years of patient, hidden warfare now had to accept the simplest rule of the trade. No reputation made a man immune to the first accurate shot. There is a later story that the German shooter took Norwest's rifle as a trophy. The source tradition around that detail is less secure than the fact of Norwest's death itself, so it should remain a story rather than a certainty. The consequences at home were more certain and more painful. Norwest's wife had died while he was overseas. Their daughters were left without either parent and were sent into Canada's residential school system. The state that had depended on their father's service delivered them into another institution built on control over Indigenous families. That is not an extra moral added to the sniper story. It is part of the same historical contradiction. The Canadian war effort could recognize Indigenous competence in the most dangerous conditions, while the country maintained structures that denied Indigenous people equal standing and autonomy. Pegahmagabow encountered that contradiction again after he returned home. The strain of 4 years at the front also followed him. The source notes that he was eventually evacuated with a diagnosis recorded as exhaustion psychosis. Language and medical understanding have changed since 1918, but the entry is a reminder that survival did not mean the war ended cleanly inside the survivor. Long periods of exposure, scouting, bombardment, gas injury, and constant vigilance carried a cumulative cost that a kill tally cannot represent. After the war, Pegahmagabow served as an elected leader and became increasingly active in Indigenous political organization. He challenged the authority exercised over Indigenous communities and pushed for greater control over political and financial affairs. Recognition for military service did not free him from the same federal system that had governed his life before enlistment. Later accounts also describe lasting health problems connected to his wartime service, including damage associated with gas exposure. He died in 1952. By then, his public meaning had expanded far beyond the image of a sniper. The soldier celebrated for operating independently in no man's land, spent part of his civilian life fighting a bureaucracy that restricted Indigenous independence at home. He became a leader in his community and an advocate for Indigenous political rights. The rights he had defended in uniform were not automatically granted to him in civilian life. His wartime service did not dissolve the system around him. That limitation matters. Military recognition is not the same thing as political equality. A medal can record courage without repairing the conditions under which the soldier lived. So what, finally, made Canadian sniper fire so disruptive? Not a magical rifle. Not a racial myth about natural hunters. Not the idea that one man could defeat a battalion by himself. The effect came from a system in which several small advantages reinforced each other. A shooter skilled at concealment and patience. An observer who could search, judge, and confirm. A rifle accurate enough for the task. A firing discipline that avoided unnecessary repetition. Camouflage that reduced the information given to the enemy. records that turned claims into something the Army could evaluate, and above all, a battlefield environment where a unit could not function without repeatedly exposing human beings to danger. That system did not make casualties irrelevant. It also did not remove the enemy's ability to adapt. Counter-snipers, shellfire, armored loopholes, darkness, camouflage, and simple changes in routine could reduce the danger. Sniper dominance was therefore local and temporary, not supernatural. Its power depended on conditions, line of sight, concealment, patience, target behavior, and the enemy's uncertainty about where the next shot might come from. It made uncertainty useful. If the enemy knew exactly where the threat was, he could answer with artillery, counter-snipers, armor, smoke, or maneuver. If he did not know, the only immediate control available was his own behavior. Keep down, wait, move at night, risk less, see less, work less. That is why a single rifle could have an effect far beyond a single body. The bullet removed one man. The unanswered possibility of the next bullet altered everyone who still had to decide whether to be seen. And that is also why the hated Ross rifle belongs in this story. Its survival in sniper hands was not a secret vindication of the weapon that Canadian infantry had rejected. It was evidence that effectiveness depends on the job being asked. The Ross had failed badly where a soldier needed a rugged rifle that could keep working through mud and mass combat. A selected Ross could still succeed where a specialist needed extreme accuracy, careful maintenance, and perhaps only one shot from a hidden position. The same reversal happened at the human level. A Canadian state that restricted Indigenous rights found itself relying on Indigenous soldiers whose existing field knowledge had immense military value. The war did not create that knowledge. It found a new use for it, and the people who carried it into battle paid for that use in ways a medal or a tally could never measure. Francis Pegahmagabow survived the war and later fought another kind of battle through political leadership and advocacy. Henry Norwest did not survive long enough to make that return. His grave in France marks the end of one life, but not the end of the method he represented. Modern sniping would become more technical, more standardized, and more integrated with surveillance and communications. Yet the basic logic visible on the Western Front remained recognizable. Observe more than you reveal, make the first shot count, and deny the opponent enough information to answer effectively. The most powerful part of that method was never the sound of the rifle. It was the silence it left behind.